I now invite Ali and Ray to come to the table for their 10-minute responses. Thanks.
I accepted Professor Keenan's invitation to serve on this panel and comment on Professor Schloesser with great enthusiasm, but combined with a good deal of trepidation. I'm delighted to see the launching of this initiative, the debate on Catholic intellectual tradition and its implications for higher education and for us at DC in particular. There is no better way to give life and meaning to the oft-used phrase, the Catholic or Jesuit identity of Boston College, than this type of exploration and dialogue among us, and later, I hope, between us and our students. And yet I'm approaching this respondent role with considerable trepidation, as I'm entirely mindful of the fact that in spite of the fact that I've been here for some 36 years as a faculty member, participating in various seminars at the Jesuit Institute with Michael Buckley, where the venue was the message and otherwise everything was free, or being invited from time to time to the inner sanctum of our university, St. Mary's Hall, that in spite of all of that, I am still an outsider to this debate. And perhaps it was in that capacity, and maybe because I'm a direct ancestor of Avicenna, that I was invited to join in at the debate. But seriously and sincerely, I speak with great humility and hope that what I have to say about this rich topic and tradition will not be too far afield. I read Steve's paper with great interest and found it to be profoundly inspiring. I believe the paper succeeds admirably in providing a rich, highly literate, and deeply spiritual reflection on the deeper meaning of Catholic intellectuality, the search, as he puts it, for some anchor in the face of unbearable weight of human beings' ephemerality and the capacity of beauty and love to transcend evanescence. His discussion of the knowledge of the sacred, I believe, goes well beyond the Catholic dictum of the inseparability of reason and faith, but it is, in my judgment, in a long mystical tradition in all three Abrahamic religions that attempts to sacralize the pursuit of knowledge itself. Reminds me of a famous line from the 14th century Persian poet Hafez, who says, "Man can ascend to such heights that he could see nothing but God. Witness how lofty is man's status before his Creator." As Steve develops his analysis of man's journey from the outward signs, what he calls the sacramentum, that is all that is open to human sight and knowledge, to that cloud of unknowing, what he describes as the divine grace, or simply God, one gets the impression that it is the individual that is cast in the role of the synthesizer, if you will, between the two realms, the et. This is, and it is the individual who comes to see, or perhaps we might say, can construct or construe the relationship between the two realms. It is only toward the end of his paper that he intimates that this quest is not entirely unguided, but rather steeped and embedded in tradition, in rituals, and various other kinds of teachings. And it is precisely here that the role of authority, dogma, intellectual constraints, the privileging of one form of knowledge over another comes into play, And it is here, of course, that the pedagogical question in a university with a religious identity begins to arise. Steve himself is certainly keenly aware of these facts, but I believe he rightly takes his principal objective in this paper to be one of setting the framework and leaves it to others to worry about the exigencies of time, these times, this place, our university. How do we go from this search for the ultimate meaning in our own times and under the present circumstances, where divergent paths to truths, including secular epistemologies that seek to explain the entire process without the sense of wonder and awe at a divine presence? How do we begin to connect the two realms that he talks about? This, of course, is the challenge, and I'm not about to take it on. This is the subject that I assume will be one of the foci of this wonderful initiative. But in the remaining 2 or 3 minutes that I have, I want to shift this discussion to where I'm a bit more comfortable and not entirely out of my element. And that is the question of what in the Catholic tradition has been particularly meaningful and powerful and compelling to me in pursuit of my intellectual life and directions at BC. For me, a very important part of the search that Steve was talking about, and he portrayed so ably, is that I take it to be a collective search. That it is from a point of view, that one has a point of view in such matters. And that point of view is embedded in particular traditions, ways of perceiving the world, and in value-laden judgments about these questions. A point of view from nowhere has no intelligibility. But beyond this cognitive need to have coherence, there has to be some level of agreement on a set of fundamental values that go beyond the exigencies of our own personal lives. And it's essential to the definition and a sense of a community and for moral solidarity. It is, if you will, the need for a cement that would hold the society together. And it is precisely in this context that I have looked and have understood or tried to understand the Catholic tradition. I find some powerful and extremely rich ideas that can help give meaning and powerful motivation to my own involvements as well as others in my world. These fall under the rubric of Catholic social teachings, including the ideas of common good, social solidarity, and the worth of the individual. And I'm only citing these by way of examples from a rich body of such teachings affirmed by various encyclicals, statements by bishops, including several statements by the General Assemblies of Jesuits. So whether it's the question of the vast inequalities in our own society and around the globe, questions of war and peace, human rights, critique of our unfettered individualism, or the culture of greed, I go back time and again to those ideals. And I may say that in this context, to put in a plug, I find the recent work of my colleague David Hollenbach, The Common Good and Christian Ethics, to be an excellent example of all that I aspire to intellectually to understand as I connect with this world. I also know that in the orientation of many of our students in the global reach that is Catholic students, and in the global reach of the Church, and in the positions of the leadership of the Church, especially since Vatican II, We have many examples of this type of engagement of the world that has a distinctly ecumenical tone and substance to it. I'm well aware that I have left out many more recent controversies within the Catholic community about matters of personal status, restrictions on freedom of choice, and the questions of abuse of trust and of authority. However, I would say that it is pitiful that in our society, religion has come to be identified, for the most part, in the public space, in the political sphere, with such hot-button matters. I have sought a different tradition, and I hope to see that tradition inform our search for what it means to be a Catholic university. And I know that this is not only a matter of words. As an example, let me simply mention and end on this. I found that the most recent statements, maybe about a month or so ago, by Cardinal Mahoney in Los Angeles, when he was talking about the fact that if a certain legislation that Congress was passing were indeed to be enacted into law, such legislation forbidding everyone and all institutions from aiding and abetting illegal immigrants, that he and all members of his church were willing to go to jail rather than to abide by that law. To me, that seemed and sounded as a perfect example of the sense of solidarity, of the deeply caring attitude about the less fortunate members of our society that one could see in a clergy. And it is that aspect of Catholicism which I find to be particularly needing in our times and informative for our debates, hopefully in the months to come. Thank you so much.
I'm very pleased to be here today to respond to Professor Schloesser's wonderful talk and to comment as well with Professor Bouazizi on resourcing the Catholic intellectual tradition for higher education. I use the word respond rather than the more common comment on because I think that's what's being asked of me today, although I have to confess I several times went back to the description of this event and to my invitation to see what exactly the task at hand was. Why this confusion about a task that is rather typical for an academic, the paper and the responsive comment? It's because normally an academic is asked to comment about a paper on a subject of which she is an expert. So in my case, that would be the legal world and its treatment of death and taxes. And yet, here I am today being asked to comment on a subject that is at some level foreign to me, the Catholic intellectual tradition. I say at some level because if you had asked me a month ago about my thoughts on the Catholic intellectual tradition, as in fact happened in this very room about a month ago when Provost Garza had those lunches, my mind would have, and in fact indeed did, draw a blank. But after reading Professor Schloesser's paper, I realized that I, in fact, knew a good deal more about the Catholic intellectual tradition than I had realized I had. How had I acquired this knowledge of a thing that until recently had no name? I imagine I developed it from my 13 years of experience here at Boston College, my participation in the Intersections program, and most especially through my many conversations with the Jesuits I have gotten to know best over my time here, people like Jim Malley and Frank Herman and Giulio Giulietti. I've come to understand this tradition as having several key components. Most importantly, that the tradition is not about answers, but instead is a mode of questioning. As Professor Schloesser puts it so wonderfully, approaching the world with a sense of wonder. Second, this mode of questioning involves two seemingly contradictory things. One is a sense of confidence that human reason is sufficient to understand what is true and good. And the second is a sense of humility with respect to answers that we may think we have found. Finally, that such an inquiry into the world has some deeper meaning and value. For those of us who are religiously inclined, it's expressed in the notion of God's immanence, that God resides in all things. But whatever the source, the notion is that there is a broader meaning to our everyday activities of searching for knowledge and mentoring students. How have these values affected my life as a professor at Boston College as opposed to other institutions? Of course, this is hard to know because I'm comparing a known with an unknown, but let me hazard a guess. Most importantly, I'd like to think that it has developed in me a healthy skepticism about the values that the world serves up to us as important. The world describes success in ways that serves the world, and not necessarily in ways that serve human flourishing. Whether it's earning the highest salary or publishing in the most prestigious places, these values must be kept in perspective. It has also encouraged me to take seriously the notion of discernment, understanding my place in the world and helping students in their path to better understand theirs. At an earlier time in my career, or perhaps at another institution, I would have viewed conversations with students about their lives as a distraction from my work. Now I see it as an essential component. Finally, it has encouraged me to think about my research in the broadest possible terms. How does my analysis of an issue comport with broader questions regarding, for the lack of a better word, the good? There's another reason for the familiarity with the Catholic intellectual tradition, as I see it in Professor Schlosser's paper, and that is that the Catholic intellectual tradition, as outlined, shares many traits with my own tradition, the Jewish intellectual tradition. I mentioned two connections in passing. Professor Schloesser refers to the fact that the Catholic intellectual tradition requires holding in tension two things which cannot be pictured together. This brought to mind the teaching of one of the great rabbis from 19th century Poland, who urged that people should always carry two slips of paper, one in each pocket. On one slip of paper should be written the Talmudic statement, "The entire world was created just for me." On the other paper should be written the words of Abraham, "I am but dust and ashes." In this way, we can maintain a balanced sense of ourselves. The other refers to what Professor Schloesser referred to as the unbridgeable gap between human knowledge and the ways of the divine. I was reading a book by a more contemporary Rabbi Harold Kushner, his book, When All You've Ever Wanted Isn't Enough, where he notes that the essence of wisdom is a respect for the limits of intelligence and a sense of reverence for the vast, dark reaches of reality where reason cannot penetrate. Like the Catholic intellectual tradition, the Jewish intellectual tradition shares the traits of asking the largest questions, with optimism about the possibility of meaning and humility with respect to our supposed answers. Of course, these connections should not be too surprising. Not only are there shared roots between these traditions, but even if there weren't, any monotheistic system shares the logical problem of managing the tension between the concept of a God sufficiently just to be worthy of devotion and the reality of a world that we live in with its seemingly deep injustices. It's not surprising that the need to grapple with these questions in a religious context results in an intellectual tradition marked by humility. Before finishing my comments today, I want to touch on this issue of my participation in this discussion and what this may or may not say about the Catholic intellectual tradition and how it plays out here at Boston College. Our discussions here today and the inclusion of Ali and me suggest that non-Catholics have an important role to play here at Boston College. On some level, this issue, of course, can't be denied because there are so many prominent faculty here of different faiths and of no faith at all. However, I'm concerned about whether the role that I am assigned today is one that I am totally comfortable with. And that's because I'm concerned about how Boston College defines itself as an institution. I put forth two possibilities, although I recognize that they are just two among many and are hardly mutually exclusive. But one is a Boston College that's primarily about the education and formation of Catholics. The other is about an institution, a Boston College, that is about the education of all, with such education being grounded in Jesuit Catholic values and traditions. Of course, both of these are legitimate enterprises for an institution that's religiously affiliated. It's just that I personally would feel much happier and more comfortable in the latter rather than the former. While discussions today suggest that I'm a full participant, I must confess that there are things at Boston College that make me worry about this. One issue that is personal and powerful to me is the lack of concern about religious diversity in the undergraduate student body, and in particular, the very small number of Jewish students in the undergraduate student body, particularly in stark relation to the presence in other local institutions. Just to get a flavor of some of the numbers, I believe that our student population, the Jewish students, are less than 1% of the student body. This compares to 30% at Harvard, 31% at Tufts, 11% at Georgetown, 23% at Northwestern, and 34% at George Washington University. I just picked those at random. While our numbers may be better than Notre Dame, I don't know. I'm not sure that one can compare South Bend, Indiana with Newton, Massachusetts. In any event, this causes me to feel like I'm less than a full player. Now, I must admit this issue is deeply personal to me, informed by the fact that I have 3 children who I feel would likely receive an excellent education here, but who I feel really I would not feel comfortable sending them to an environment where I'm afraid they would be so marginalized. So all of this causes me to worry that we are, or I am, unwittingly participating in the propagation of what we in the law call a bait and switch, something that promises wonder and engagement, but in fact offers something a little bit less than that. I look forward to our future discussions, and I hope that my fears are not the reality, but I would feel remiss in not at least introducing them today. Thank you.